Good morning or good evening, and welcome to the workshop about furthering environmental justice perspectives in our research. The idea of this workshop originated with a group of PhD students in the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program at Princeton, who are the driving force putting together this workshop. I want to acknowledge the organizing committee, including Nick Cholette-Levy, who is a doctoral student that leads the committee. In addition, doctoral students Malini Nambiar and Pooja Ramamurthy and Melissa Tier helped organize the workshop with assistance from postdocs including Sarah Constantino and Frank Errickson. And last but not least, Kelly Swan, the Assistant Director of the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, or C-PREE, at Princeton, guided the organization of this workshop. The workshop is sponsored by C-PREE, which is an interdisciplinary research center at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. Co-sponsors of this event include the Annlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, the Office of Sustainability, and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. So the purpose of this workshop is to bring together different perspectives on environmental justice and help facilitate discussions and connections between researchers seeking to incorporate environmental justice in their research. The members of the planning committee saw a need for deepening this conversation at Princeton, and we're here to learn and discuss, and thought others across campus might also appreciate the space to connect on this topic. So we hope that this workshop will lead to further conversations and opportunities for collaboration. The workshop is divided into two parts. So the first session is a plenary, which I will moderate with Frank Errickson. And so the purpose of the first session is to provide a high-level overview of incorporating environmental justice from the lens of researchers in different fields. And the second session, we will break out into smaller groups on the topics of coastal resilience, air pollution, energy systems, and climate governance. And that session will go into deeper dives into each of these areas with the opportunity for researchers to more directly engage in discussions about specific research. So I'll now pass it over to Melissa Tier.
Thanks, Erin. So we want to begin this event by recognizing that the land on which Princeton stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. We take a moment to honor the Lenape caretakers of these lands and waters, both here in the homeland and throughout the diaspora, as well as to honor the elders who lived here before and the generations to come. We also want to encourage our attendees to engage with Lenape history and culture, such as by exploring tribal government resources, and we'll post an example link in the chat in a moment. And another incredible resource to highlight is the Native Land Digital Map, which is an Indigenous-led initiative to map Indigenous territories, and which aims to foster conversations about the history of colonialism, settler-Indigenous relations, and Indigenous ways of knowing. We'll also post that link in just a moment, and I hope that you can take time after this event to take a look. I'd like to now pass the virtual mic over to Ijoma Wagu for a brief overview of opportunities with Office of Sustainability.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the gift of your time to share a little bit about our Campuses Lab program, which is run out of the Office of Sustainability, where I serve as Assistant Director. Can everyone see my screen? I just want to be sure you can see that.
I think you need to put it in presentation mode.
In presentation mode, just a second. Okay, perfect. So our mission in the Office of Sustainability is to accelerate sustainability action at all scales. And here we're situated in the campus, but what we see is the opportunity to use that as a place from which we can advance sustainability in the broader community and the world. And one of the ways that we do this is through the Campuses Lab projects, which is the program I want to share a little bit with you this morning about. So the Campuses Lab projects, what we do here is to facilitate the use of Princeton's campus as a test bed for understanding and applying sustainability through research and through classroom activities that are based here on campus. And the purpose of the program is to advance the student experience through experiential learning opportunities, to improve the campus, because all of the projects are focused, all of the research projects are focused on sustainability action on campus. And the idea is to build replicable models. These can serve as models to communities and peer institutions beyond our walls. And through the Campuses Lab program, we support a range of research initiatives, interdisciplinary research initiatives, many of them focused on the sciences. And some of the recent projects we have supported include a project that explores the impact of consumption at Princeton on surrounding communities. And we also had a recent project which explored how to reduce the use of single occupancy vehicles traveling into campus. So it's interdisciplinary. We support a range of projects, and environmental justice is an area that we're also looking at getting more projects in this area. And I'd like to share with you the resources available through the Campuses Lab program for your projects. First is funding. So we support research projects through our High Meadows Foundation Sustainability Fund up to the tune of $10,000. We also support your projects around data. We have many data sets, for example, Tiger Energy live streams that a number of researchers have incorporated into their projects, and other data sets that might be useful to your projects. And finally, we provide coordination support because sometimes it's difficult to navigate the bureaucracy around citing projects and doing research on campus. So we support researchers doing sustainability projects to get the buy-in and the support of operations and facilities team to enhance their projects. And there's so much more that I'd like to share with you, but there is very little time this morning. There's a lot to cover today, but here are my contacts, and I will also drop them on the chat in case you'd like to know more about how to get support from the Campuses Lab program for your research projects. We're always there to help with funding, with data, and with coordination support. And thank you so much for this opportunity to at least tell you a little bit about this resource for sustainability, for generating sustainability knowledge and motivating action in this field. Thank you.
Thanks, Ijoma. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for the plenary. So first up, Paulina Jaramillo is a professor in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University and the co-director of the Green Design Institute. Her past research has focused on life cycle assessment of energy systems, and she's currently researches energy consumption, infrastructure systems, and public policy for sustainable global development. Braneon is a remote sensing specialist with NASA and co-leads the Climate and Environmental Health Working Group at Goddard Applied Sciences. He is also the co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change and co-director of the Environmental Justice and Climate Just Cities Network with the Earth Institute. He researches urban design for climate adaptation and mitigation and technological tools that can support urban resilience. Pradip Swarnakar is an associate professor of sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur, India. He specializes in climate change adaptation and policy, social network analysis, and sustainable transitions. His research focuses on analysis of climate policy networks in multiple countries, including India, Finland, United States, Brazil, and Australia. And finally, Josh Apte is a professor at University of California, Berkeley's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the School of Public Health. His expertise lies in air quality engineering and techniques for air pollution exposure assessment. And so his research focuses on technologies, policies, and strategies to reduce inequities and exposure to environmental pollutants with a geographical focus in Asia and elsewhere in the developing world. With that, I'll turn it over to Frank, and we'll start off with a few questions for our panelists, then open it up to questions from the audience. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome to all of our panelists. Just want to start off and learn a bit more about all of your work. So maybe we can keep our answers to around 4 minutes just to get through this. But for the first question, can you describe your research and what broadly motivates you to work on environmental justice and equity issues? And maybe we'll start with Paulina.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with my co-panelists. My work on equity really is focuses on international climate and energy equity, particularly on how do we ensure equitable energy access in developing countries while meeting global climate mitigation targets. So my motivation for that, and I work primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, where energy consumption levels are very low. There's still a lot of people without access to even basic electricity. So there's a big need for supporting energy growth for development. But with massive population growth, the decisions we make today about the energy infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa could really be detrimental to climate mitigation efforts. So really thinking about those, how do we enable the energy that countries in the region need to develop and enable climate mitigation, and what are the climate equity implications of that?
Great, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Christian.
Good morning, everyone. So pleased to be here with my fellow co-panelists. My research focuses on climate variability, climate adaptation, and their intersection with environmental justice. A lot of my work involves using satellite data to understand changes on the ground, at the land surface or at the ocean surface. And I also use global climate models to assess climate change impact as well as climate vulnerability. To understand anthropogenically driven global climate change is complex because it involves integrating many traditionally independent sciences. And so most folks use tools that rely on systems theory. And so I would say my work uses a systems approach with its roots in systems theory. And I'm doing quite a bit of modeling to understand climate change impacts on urban, agricultural, and natural environment. I have a particular interest in translating the uncertainty associated with climate research and associated with climate change, and helping stakeholders use that in meaningful ways. Central to the approach I use, which is a systems approach, is the idea that an ecosystem or agricultural system or urban system is a complex system that will exhibit some emergent properties when all these parts come together. And so I'm relying on systems dynamics to understand the nonlinear behavior of the complex systems I study. To give you some specific examples, I'm looking at green infrastructure in Chicago and other places and trying to evaluate whether there's true cooling benefits associated with green infrastructure or are the cooling benefits assumed. I'm also quantifying the historic and future changes in coastal marshes. In another project, sea level rise is causing marshes in their ecosystem services to disappear at an alarming rate due to the submergence of the coastal marshes. And so I'm hoping with this research project that I'm describing that I can produce new data products that provide valuable information on the role of coastal marshes on global carbon and nutrient cycles. And then my agricultural research has focused on assessing irrigation demand and the uncertainty associated with demand projections that rely on climate change. And I'm also doing some work related to drought and the impacts of drought on air quality across different landscapes.
Great, thank you. Pradip, would you like to go next?
Hi, good morning. I'm Pradip, and I'm a sociologist, and I started working on environmental and climate issues quite a bit time. But what motivates me to engage in this kind of research, I can say two experiences from my own research. So during my PhD, I was more involved in groundwater contamination in remote villages in India, and where we have arsenic contaminations, and people were facing injustices and discriminations, and they are having negative health impacts as well as negative social impacts of stigmatization and other kind of social problems. On the other hand, what I observed during my field work as a Fulbright in the Central Valley of California is that agricultural laborers from particular ethnic backgrounds are vulnerable and struggling to cope with drought. Some communities have access to water for even irrigation, but economically and socially marginalized communities do not have access to drinking water. So these are two different experiences related to water for two different countries, and that ignites my idea to work on environmental justice. And with a few PhD and postdoc students, I started a group at Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, which is called Climate and Energy Policy Research Lab. And what I can say that climate change is a global issue, but the impact and liability are distributed disproportionately, particularly to the people of Global South. The major challenge regarding fighting with adverse effect of climate change is that we have to collaborate, even if we have very personalized or localized interest. And sometimes these interests are conflicting. As a sociologist, I'm interested in finding out the barrier of collective action regarding large-scale socio-technical changes. There are multiple ways to study this problem, but particularly I am interested in policy network. So how a government is making policies and with which stakeholders like business, civil society organizations, or research organizations, they are collaborating and maintaining, coming up with some new policies. So in environmental justice literature, procedural justice is an important concept where researchers want to identify how inclusive is the process of policymaking in a country. So to elaborate, I can take one example that justice has two sides, international and domestic. And countries like India always are very much in favor of a concept called common but differentiated responsibility, where they want to put the historical responsibility to the developed countries and they want right to growth. At present, I am looking two important projects. One is the energy transition in the power plants, and how just is the energy transition. So for that just energy transition, we are looking at the trade unions of power plants and coal mines and how ready they are, because sooner or later the fossil fuel and coal-based power plant will be decommissioned. So whether the people who are large amount of people who are very much their livelihood is involved in this kind of activity, how ready they are and what are the role of trade unions in this respect. Another important area of research is my studying policy network, like how different stakeholders are engaged in climate policy. So we have conducted a policy network survey before Paris, but right now we are also conducting another round of survey for policy network and try to identify what are the common beliefs and practices of different stakeholders. We also study the media, the communication, so how the role of media is there and what are the beliefs which are coming out from the different stakeholders in the media. So these are some of our research. We also work a little bit, some of our students work on air pollution and forest rights, but some of the risk and justice perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Josh.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks everybody for being here. It's really exciting to be on such a diverse panel. So I'll share a little bit about what I work on and sort of how I came to do what I do. So broadly, I'm interested in air pollution exposure assessment and its intersections with local and global environmental justice. And when I started in grad school, I had very little idea that this is exactly what I wanted to be doing. I had sort of one really formative experience about 15 or 16 years ago where I was kind of with virtually no qualifications out of undergrad working on water quality in villages of South India to help commission some water treatment systems for tsunami affected villages. And in my times in small Indian cities, I just got really interested in the sort of the connection between the huge number of vehicles that were obviously very new and popping up in cities that didn't really exist on maps that you'd read back home in the US, and thinking about the massive energy demand. And of course, as I'd spent time as an environmental science student as an undergrad, I got very interested in issues of energy demand in the developing world. But the obvious problem to me, just walking around small towns and small cities in South India, was that the air pollution problem was immense. And there seemed to be so few people at that time talking about the linkages between climate change and air pollution. And while some of the climate dimensions of increasing energy use in the developing world have incredibly thorny ethical dimensions, like Pradip was just talking about, the air pollution problems are here, they're now, and they directly affect people wherever those energy end uses are happening. And so that got me really interested in air pollution, and specifically air pollution exposure. So what we actually breathe, and the difference between what you measure in sort of the official paradigm of air pollution measurement and what you breathe is sort of a constant theme in environmental justice over time. That that in basically every environmental justice problem you come across, exposures are often largely underplayed or misidentified by sort of the official techniques that are used for characterizing any kind of environmental burden. And so now fast forward 15 years of being a grad student and a postdoc and now a professor, I'd say that the things that I work on have sort of a multi-scale and multi-geography and multi-method character, but I'm going to try to draw a few themes together here quickly. So on the multi-scale perspective, I'm interested in problems as they exist, at very fine scales, like the city block. And so, how do exposure disparities even exist from the city block to city block scale? Obviously, there are also immense air pollution exposure disparities between high income and low income countries. And so I spent a lot of time working on air quality in India over the past 15 years. And it's been really gratifying to be working on this issue as it's kind of exploded into the global limelight. And I feel like it's an opportunity to actually contribute something to this really high level policy dialogue that's now happening. In terms of multi-method, in order to understand what to do about environmental inequity problems, you really need to understand what the sources of air pollutants are, in addition to knowing what the disparate burdens are. And so some of the kinds of techniques we use in my group include really high resolution measurements of the chemical composition of air pollutants, where we're taking the small PM2.5 particles that we breathe and blasting them apart and looking at the molecular signatures of what the different kinds of sources are as a way of identifying, okay, what's actually impacting the air we breathe. And so I work very closely with colleagues at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, trying to understand air pollution levels in Delhi, which is one of the most polluted big cities on the planet. I also do similar techniques here in the US in environmental justice communities. I guess the second sort of way that we think about air pollution is in hyperlocal measurements. And that's kind of a catch-all term that includes things like low-cost sensors, like the purple air monitors you might be familiar with, or the ramp monitors that our friends at Carnegie Mellon, like Paulina, work with. And then finally, mobile measurements. So setting up mobile laboratories. I've worked pretty extensively with Google using their Street View cars as a way of mapping out disparities in air pollution block by block. And then the third major technique is using air pollution simulation models that tell us source by source what kinds of different, at reasonably fine spatial resolution, what are the major source sectors that drive air pollution. And that's super important for understanding sort of how the different sectors of the economy contribute to disparities. And so I think one of the emerging themes that comes out when I think about environmental justice is that there are sort of relevant disparities at nearly every scale. And so oftentimes the environmental injustice conversation in the US focuses on sort of the disparities that exist within a neighborhood or within a city or living on the wrong side of the tracks. But the disparities that we start to see in my research really exist at basically any scale you can think of, whether it's sort of state by state, country by country, urban, rural, within a city. And understanding what moves the needle on what could address those disparities is kind of the big question I'm interested in right now. So I'll keep it at that for now.
Great, thank you, Josh. So a number of the motivations we just heard also touch on how you are all thinking about the concept of environmental justice itself. And so we were hoping you could delve into that a bit more with the two-part question. So for this question, the first part is, how do you define environmental justice or equity in your work? And second, how have you seen this definition evolve over time in your specific field? So let's start with Paulina.
So I work more on energy equity, which I think it's closely associated with environmental equity and environmental justice. Well, because energy is a big source of pollution that drives environmental justice issues, but it's also needed for, in my context, needed for development. So my interest is really or the focus I give to my work on, let's call it energy justice on an international context, is how do we enable the poorest people in the world to gain access to energy resources that they need to improve human well-being, while I guess not destroying, let me see, how do I say? While still supporting efforts for environmental sustainability. And that has two issues, right? One is climate change especially is a global problem, but also the poorest people in developing countries are probably much more vulnerable than I am to climate change and have lower adaptive capacity. So energy justice and climate justice are closely interlinked, and we can't just ignore that these countries need energy for development, but if they go on a fossil heavy route, it's game over for climate, and they will be seriously affected by it. And so I'm convinced that there has to be a way where we can do both things. And that's where I'm really interested in understanding what are those things we can do and how do we ensure that the costs and the benefits are equitably distributed. So I really think there's a very important role for countries in the global north and developed countries to help with climate or carbon neutral development of the poorest countries in the world. But we need to have more information about what that looks like, how much does it cost, what technologies are going to be needed, so we can develop appropriate mechanisms for pursuing those pathways. So that's I think unlike some of the other people in the panel, I'm a modeler, so I see a little removed from the individual stakeholders. I do work with, or I do have partnerships and connections with governments and other entities in the countries where I work, but I'm not working on an individual case, individual person connection. I'm more looking at a bigger picture. I don't know if that answers the question. Maybe other panelists can answer and I can add things to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Christian, would you like to chime in next?
Sure. I think of environmental justice as a concept that refers to making sure that no community takes on an unfair share of environmental burdens, and each community is able to benefit equitably from the environment. And as other colleagues have mentioned, you can think of this at different scales, from a global scale. Part of my big interest in climate-related research came from the legacy of colonialism. And I was thinking when I was a graduate student, how it was surprising that whenever we talked about countries with growing economies, we never brought up colonization and basically how their entire societies were disrupted, how their populations were stagnant or decreased as a result of stealing human capital from those countries through slavery or murder and marginalization in those places. And so I started off really thinking a lot about doing work in Africa, in particular East Africa, but then I realized we have so many environmental justice and equity issues right here in the US. I think there's been a big evolution around having more community involvement and meaningful community involvement at that. I think that's the big change I've seen. And also more emphasis on benefit, benefits from solar energy, benefits from natural amenities, other environmental benefits. I think historically, people kind of thought only about the pollution burdens. And I think a lot of this has to do just with younger generations being a little less segregated and really honestly having less racist ideas than older generations. When we talk about environmental justice, we're usually thinking of marginalized communities in the US being lower income communities and communities of color. And so there's this tendency where lower income communities and communities of color take on more environmental burden. But because we're socialized not to talk about race, most critical race theory scholars will say, then you really don't have a complex understanding of race if you don't talk about it. And so people struggle to identify racism. And so I think as we've become more integrated, at least in the US, there's more discussions about race happening. There's this understanding it's not sufficient to be not racist. You should be aggressively against racism. Each moment offers the opportunity to be anti-racist in our actions and anti-racist and take anti-racist measures. And so, when I went to Durban, South Africa, a couple of years ago for a climate adaptation workshop, every conversation we had there started with an emphasis on undoing apartheid and undoing racist policies, and how could we leverage research to do that. And so we haven't had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the US that they've had in South Africa. We probably need something like that so that we have a shared understanding of history, so we can kind of undo the racist narratives we've been taught, and realize that that these are racist ideas that they've been injected into our thinking, and they affect our research as well. They affect who we choose to be professors and researchers, who we choose to publish, and in terms of research, I think the big change is we realize that we have to stop thinking of discussions about discrimination and racism as political. This is just fact. This is just the reality of our society. And researchers play an important role through environmental justice and equity related research in undoing those past racist policies and racist discriminatory measures.
Great, thank you, Christian. Pradip?
Thank you, Christian and Paulina, for raising important issues. To add this, I'd like to highlight two things about environmental and climate justice. So we can look at this justice from a policy perspective, the policymaker, that comes under procedural justice. But any questions or discussion on justice should start with a concept called recognition. So we should first recognize that there are some injustices, either it had already happened, or it is happening, or it's going to happen. So if we do not recognize that injustices, then we cannot further do any kind of action or movement or research on environmental justice. So when we are making some policies, national policies, international policies by United Nations, we have to understand like how we are making policy, whether this policy by design is inclusive or not. So as a policy network researcher, we try to identify the coalition framework, how different coalitions, national and international coalitions, they are forming. And in this formation, in this design of policy making, whether they are including all the various voices that should be heard from very marginalized communities. Like, for example, I can say that when in India we are designing climate policy, we are consulting think tanks and research organizations which may be very close to the capital city, but there are communities, there are civil society organizations which are working in a remote coastal areas, looking at the vulnerability of the fisherman, or like hilly areas, looking at the forest problems and their livelihood problem, but that might not have people are actually including in the process. So we know that we have bottom up and top down limitations, and in my book I have tried to highlight the problem of bottom up and top down policy making. But if we compare internationally in this policy making, we have observed that recently we were working on Australia, Brazil and India on climate policy making, and we have observed that in India there is, in the United States, there's a strong group of climate denials. So they play an important role. And when there is a denial, they are actually contributing very much to this justice and injustice questions. But in India, there is not less denial. There are silent people. And the role of science, so when we are talking about the denial group, they are actually not accepting what science is talking about the climate change. But in India, we have a very strong acceptance of science, but in terms of doing something voluntarily or for any kind of outside pressure in the policy making, that is quite lacking. And another point, apart from policy, I'd like to highlight in environmental and climate justice research as a sociologist is the mobilization. So any kind of injustices, actually only people hear those injustices when people raise their voice as a community, not as an individual. So this community protest movement, and recently we have observed that there were farmers protest movement in India, and one climate activist, very young climate activist, she was arrested because she tweeted what Greta actually tweeted, supporting the farmers movement. Now, this kind of civil rights, human rights associated with environmental and climate issues are also very important if we want to study climate justice. So yeah, and another final point I'd like to make from our research is that when we're talking about energy transition and access to energy, as Paulina was saying, it's very important. But the thing is that we are transitioning from a fossil fuel based to non-fossil fuel based, and India is very much to pro-solar because they are the major stakeholders of International Solar Alliance. But the thing is that our existing power plants and coal mines are located in some part of the country, and the new power plants in the different parts of the country. So how to match this, how to create a justice or like a rehabilitation system, that is really challenging. It is easy to say or criticize as a researcher, but also it's a policy challenge. So it needs an involvement and collective actions of different stakeholders for a more equitable, sustainable policy making. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pradip. Josh?
Yeah, hi. So I want to share a couple of brief thoughts, and I'll try to keep it brief. So in terms of how I think about environmental equity and environmental justice, I think that I think about things in terms of exposure, and I think about things in terms of risk, and I think about things in terms of power. So I want to talk briefly about each of those concepts. So exposure is something that is much more easily measured than risk. It involves actually going and looking at the differential rates at which communities are experience different levels of pollution burdens. But exposure is only one of many determinants of environmental risk. So if maybe you've seen sort of these archetypal cartoons of schematics of sort of an environmental health paradigm that starts with emissions and then goes to concentrations and exposures, and then ultimately the health risks that result from those exposures. And one thing that we know is that different communities have very different susceptibility to environmental risks, and much of our environmental regulation in the US at least is really heavily structured around trying to make sure that nobody exceeds some maximum concentration. So it's trying to limit the maximally exposed individual, but it's not necessarily focused on trying to make sure that that risks are more equitably distributed across society. And I think that many environmental justice communities feel like that, and very rightly so, that they are at the disparate recipients of excess environmental risks that come from the cumulative exposures from all kinds of different environmental stressors. Of course, as Christian mentioned, there's also the flip side of environmental benefits, and I think that the conversation really is shifting to not just be about disparate burdens, but also thinking about disparate benefits. I think that's really welcome and wonderful as well. In terms of power, Pradip briefly mentioned this issue of procedural justice. I think that is very much a recurring theme in the way that the EJ conversation in the US is turning, that community groups are getting more and more and more involved in the policymaking process as stakeholders and as parties to the decisions that are made around improving our environmental quality and reducing disparities in the US. And that's, of course, absolutely necessary. You can't have a conversation about addressing environmental justice unless you put communities front and center in those conversations. I think that there is a small risk that I see with this emerging trend towards more and more community engagement. And it's a risk that I think needs to be thought about carefully, but one certainly should not move away from this sort of increasing focus on communities. And the risk is that as we empower communities to be more present in the conversation around EJ, we don't want to make the mistake of making communities responsible for solving those problems or responsible for being the only locus where we target these problems, because a lot of the environmental injustice problems that we have, at least within the US, really result from systemic racism and systemic inequality. And if we make the mistake of focusing too heavily on the communities when the problems are really systemically driven, we run the risk of both a rather ineffective solution and one that really doesn't place responsibility where it maybe ethically lies. Okay, so those are a few quick comments, and I'd like to just move on.
Thanks. Paulina, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so clearly I am the least trained on equity and equity language. I come from an engineering background, and I landed in the world of equity just because of my interest in the global South. And to Josh's point, a lot of the concerns with international environmental justice are also systemic. They're also from a long history of colonialism and oppression of countries in the global South. And so it is really like this idea, when I talk about we can't just ignore the development pathways of global South, there's this bit of a reaction of I'm putting the burden of low carbon development on those countries that can afford it the least. And I don't think that's where I'm coming from. I'm more coming from, we haven't even studied what these transitions look like in these countries. There's this assumption that it's like low carbon development is going to be more expensive, but no one has really even quantified what that is like, or what that may, or what technologies may be needed and at what cost. Do we need to define cost targets and invest in research and development to reach those cost targets so the technologies are accessible to those countries, right? So while I'm not thinking as much about like the burden of responsibility and who pays, my point is more about creating the information that can inform those discussions, because right now we're having those discussions kind of from a blind spot with a lot of we think and know not much empirical support for our priors on the issue. So I agree with the discussion about systemic issues and equity of who is burdened with the responsibility. If there are engineers, my point is an engineer without being well versed in a lot. I mean, just getting to know all of the sociological and social science components of equity. I think there's still opportunities for engineers to engage in these discussions by providing the information that can support the discussion. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Paulina. So I want to remind and encourage attendees to submit questions. So I'll pose another question. So what is your personal philosophy regarding how to engage with EJ communities in research, or alternatively put, what are the guiding ethical principles that dictate how you engage with EJ communities in research? And so I'll flip the order and start with Pradip.
Okay, so as a sociologist or social anthropologist who are working on community and going to the field, talking to the people, I think there are some risks when we are engaging this kind of research, because as I'm interested in climate and energy movement mobilizations, that means people are actually asking for their rights. Now, we are talking to people who are activists, but we are a researcher. So we need to understand few things before going to the field. We have to be very sensitive to their cause and also be maybe very showing empathy, but we have to be very much value neutral, because we should be sensitive and empathetic to the plight of the people struggling with environmental issue, but value neutral in our reporting and writing. So this is one important thing I think we should remember when we are engaging environmental justice kind of study. And we should also break the researcher-respondent power relations, because it's not like I'm going to a community and talking to the people. So we should understand like what exactly is their voice and why they are, because these kind of mobilization many times are anti-state or anti-business who are really powerful. So, and many places, including India, people have observed like people are protesting, like there's a coal mine, like Mahan coal mine, and people are protesting for their rights. And then the police and the state machineries, they are actually stopping the people to doing this kind of research. So these are the challenges as a field worker in this kind of environmental justice and movement studies. But I think we should, as a researcher, we should provide a platform that will help both the policymakers, because sometimes these injustices are coming because of new law, because of old law, because of the policy. So we have to be sensitive for both the policymakers as well as the community. I think it is very difficult to balance these two things, because their interests are completely different and sometimes very much conflicting. So as a researcher, we need to be, again, I'd say that we have to be value neutral and look both the sides of the picture. Thank you.
Thanks, Pradip. Moving to Josh, if you want to go next.
Yeah, sure. So, God, there's so much to say about how to effectively engage with EJ groups. And I feel like every day I'm also reminded of how not to engage with EJ groups. And, I think that it's good to be a little bit vulnerable and self-critical and sort of sharing my own reflections about, what I've learned about effective ways to be engaged in this process and less effective ways to do so. So I feel like I started this process somewhat innocent and clueless, and in ways that maybe reflect some of the same thoughts that Paulina was just sharing. And I think that I feel like I've been really lucky to have worked with community groups that have held me accountable to wrong ways of thinking about things, but in a way where it's not like they don't want me to be working with them. It's more like they want to make sure that I realize that there's been a long history of missteps in the way that academics, especially academics from really privileged elite institutions, have worked with EJ communities, and that that there are ways to do better. And so one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about right now is the fact that the traditional means by which academics develop research questions is you have conversations in your research group, you have conversations at conferences, you talk to other people like you within your academic community, and you develop research questions that may be around the theme of environmental justice, but they're not coming from the perspective of lived experience. They're coming from the perspective of here are the issues that we talk about and we think about in our own academic communities. And I think that of course, as scientists, we're always going to continue doing that, but it's really essential to move not only change sort of who participates in as members of our own research group, but who gets the authority to develop research questions to be broader and more inclusive. And so I think that I'm not super skilled at this yet, but I really aspire to have a much broader array of partnerships with community groups where communities are thinking, helping me think about how to frame the right questions, or I'm taking questions that others generate that are really good questions I never would have thought of, and helping apply the analytical tools that our group can bring to bear on them. So I want to talk about one international dimension of this as well. It's sort of one very formative conversation I had 12 years ago or so that I never really expected. A long time ago, I was a Fulbrighter at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. And my mentor at IIT Delhi, or my prospective mentor at this point, I think I'd not even applied, said, Josh, I don't care whether you get any useful papers for your PhD out of your Fulbright in Delhi. All I care about is that you learn how to ethically engage in scholarship in India and become aware of the power dynamics that you bring with. And if you learn that over your year in India, I'd be very happy with you. And at the time I thought, well, that's kind of a kooky perspective. Well, that's certainly not what I'm here for. And over time, I just realized how right that advice was. And I feel like I've sort of cherished that advice over the years. But I think it's really important to be open to being put in your place as an academic of who you are and where you come from. So I guess that's the main takeaway here.
Thanks, Josh. Moving to Christian.
Yeah, I totally agree with the comments from the other panelists. I think the individual work is so important. I encourage researchers that are interested in environmental justice to do the individual work of confronting their own biases. What racist narratives have you been taught? What sexist narratives have you been taught? What narratives around gender? You really want to develop some cultural competency, so you should learn about the communities or the countries that are in the areas where you're studying. Learn about the history. Even within the U.S., there's such a limited understanding of history. If we ask probably the folks attending, how did the population of indigenous people change before and after colonization? They probably could not say or quantify the loss of life or the reduction in the population, but we could quantify the loss of life associated with recent wars or the Holocaust. So the Holocaust. So I think this kind of reflects whose lives we value and who do we focus on in history within the U.S. I agree also that we should involve communities in the conceptualizing of the project. The earlier, the better. There's some tension here because you can often be quicker and faster to not involve the communities, but there's this risk of you developing research that has unintended consequences, right? Because you're not really an expert of that community, even if you believe that you are. You're not actually an expert unless even if you're from that community, you may not be an expert. So I think that's vitally important. It's really critical that the research reflects the needs and desires of the community. And so for me, I emphasize for myself continuing to grow, doing training around bias myself, involving communities as early as I can in the process, asking for feedback, as Josh alluded to, from the communities themselves, and really pointing out to others when I see some gaps in their approach to community engagement.
Thanks, Christian. And finally, Paulina.
So like I said before, I don't have that many opportunities to engage directly with communities, although when I started doing work in Africa and I realized I had never even been to a continent, I did move to the continent for a year, and it was an eye-opening experience. There's definitely something about Africa where anyone who goes falls in love and wants to stay, which was true for us. And I tried to continue going, and again, communicating with not necessarily the communities, but the government agencies and the NGOs that are working in the area. And then, so I don't have as much to say about particularly working with the community. One of the things I do think that also contributes from an academic point of view to this environmental justice perspective is the students that we mentor, and who those students are and where they come from. And so that is where I've been trying very hard to really support students who are committed to the issues, who have a connection to the issues, and will, after they leave CMU, have a well-rounded technical training, but also understand the context of where they're working, the communities in which they're working, and have a connection to those communities. So for my Africa work, I typically work with students I try to work with students from Africa. And so I don't think I have that much more to say.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience, and just wanted to kind of synthesize a few of those. So this is just open to all the panelists. Is it possible to have energy or climate justice under current economic and political systems? And if so, does your work, any results from your work point to any potential ways forward to achieve these outcomes? If anybody wants to chime in.
Well, I'll jump in. I think there definitely is that capacity within the U.S. You know, we operate from a capitalist system, and so folks who have had wealth historically are passing on that wealth, and as a result, if your family was wealthy historically, just like in other countries, this changes your outlook moving forward. The way in our current systems, and at least at the city level, but at other levels, we're coming up with ways to encourage equity or create equity through different actions and measures, you know, that could come together as policies. So I think there are ways to move forward. I think we just have to commit to creating equity. A lot of plans at the city level talk about equity and speak about equity, and it sometimes really just seems like a way to win elections or get some short-term support. So there isn't really any obstacle, I think, to creating equity. It's just a commitment to saying if we've had segregation and allowed people of color to subsidize the education and other services for people who identify as white, what would be the problem then in doing that, to create doing something anti-racist to create equity so that everyone is on the same playing field. So I don't think there's a real obstacle other than willpower in our current system.
Maybe I'll reform the question a little bit. So with respect to your research, how has that work been practically used into decision-making, or how do you see it being practically used within decision-making or within the context of our current institutions? And anybody can answer. Josh?
I'll share a thought. So for some of you who work on air pollution, you may know of a law in California called AB 617 that was really, I think, put together, among other things, as part of a political compromise and patch around California's climate change laws. So what AB 617 does is it empowers community groups and directs the state to empower community groups to formulate community air protection plans and to basically engage more directly with disadvantaged communities and disparately burdened communities around the process of understanding the local sources of air pollution and how they might be best targeted from the community perspective. And so the kind of work that we've done on hyperlocal air pollution mapping in EJ communities in California, I think has really been a shot in the arm for helping community groups realize that they have the power to measure, understand, characterize the sources of air pollution burdens and and then advocate using data to bring those solutions back to the state policymakers. And so part of this is sort of most environmental problems are governed in a technocratic way anywhere in the world. The degree of technical capacity that the state has to provide that kind of environmental governance, of course, is really different, say, in India versus the US. But technocratic means of environmental regulation often exclude the communities that face that burden because of disparate access to the knowledge that's needed, or the skills, or the measurement tools, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that there are ways to create patches within our system to fix that. I think that AB 617, if you talk to many environmental justice groups, has not fundamentally changed the power dynamics in any transformational way, but I think it is definitely an improvement. And so, to some of the questions in the chat window, I think there are limitations of how far you can go within a capitalist system, perhaps, but on the other hand, that's the system we've got. So I want to make change now. I'm not waiting for the revolution to do that.
I'll jump in again. I think a lot of recent research is focused on redlining. There's some really amazing work by Vivek Chandas and Jeremy Hoffman and others, where they've shown that there's elevated land surface temperatures in places where redlining took place. Redlining is a racist policy that made folks that identified, folks who are communities that had people of color, or Jewish people, were given lower grades, and which inhibited their ability to get federally backed loans for homes. And so this has really actually shaped and formed our segregation patterns across the U.S. There's cities are beginning actually to use that research to inform how they make investments around green infrastructure. And so I think that research is just a kind of a clear example around environmental justice and how it's influencing policy.
Thanks, and I think we have time for one more audience question, and this might be kind of suitable for Pradip and Paulina. And Paulina touched on it already a bit. So the question was posed as, how much do developed countries owe the developing countries to help them transition to cleaner energy sources in the context of environmental justice? And Pradip, if you want to.
Yeah, so this is very critical questions, and generally people always ask during the climate of party meetings, annual meetings, and that was the main debate. And as I remember during Paris, people were talking about the temperature level rise 1.5 or 2 and how the economy is going to be affected. Now, it is quite evident, as also the other panel members, they have identified, like Paulina, working on the energy access in Africa. So it's not the access of energy, if we just focus on energy for the time being, is not there. So still people do not have the electricity all over the world, maybe in India, maybe in Bangladesh, or maybe in African countries. Now, whether we'll go to the access of energy, or whether we'll go to the non-fossil fuel energy. And if we want to do this both things together, we need a lot of things. First, we need money. So Green Climate Fund is a fund created by this group, but not many people are actually contributing to this Green Climate Fund. That means people are hesitant to contribute, because otherwise how the marginalized groups or the countries who they don't, I mean, R&D transfer, because science and technology plays, and innovation particularly, plays a very important role in this transition. but because of the background resources, the amount of research the universities in the United States, they can do research in like in sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Africa, they cannot afford to do for their own sustainability. Maybe their requirement is also very less. Their per capita consumption is also less. That is why this covered but differentiated responsibility, that is based on historical responsibility, and there is a concept called luxury emission. So whether what kind of lifestyle actually you are adopting, a person in sub-Saharan Africa, what is the per capita carbon consumption, and person in California, for example, what is the per capita carbon consumption, that may vary. So it's so complex, and what we are trying to do, we are trying to integrate all various like n number of levels. It is not about country, within country there is variations, different countries there is variations, we are in a different path of development. So integrating all this together and with a specific very close deadline like 10, 20 or 30 years, it is really challenging. But the good thing is that at least during Paris, people have acknowledged, because always climate meeting failed, like in Copenhagen and all these things. At least people acknowledge that there is some problem. So, I mean, France has actually done these things very diplomatically and asked for like voluntary commitment, INDCs, or intended, what you intend. Now, after 5 years, they are asking, look, okay, well, you have already committed to do certain things, whatever you have done. It is like giving a home task and just checking what you have done after 5 years. Now, the thing is that how equitable is the system within the country and outside the country? And the questions always people are asking that, okay, the developed countries are already developed, United States, Canada, Eastern Europe, and all these things. So your thing is that maybe you do not want to cut maybe trees, deforestation, afforestation, REDD+ countries. This is a huge debate. But Brazil or other REDD+ countries, I mean, they are dependent on forest. So if you are not going to cut the forest, how they are going to survive? So whenever we are actually having a conflicting interest, and that is why I said that my basic interest, how collaboratively people can actually do any kind of policy making, because collaboration is the only way. We know that we have conflicting interests as a country, as a community, as a person, but how collaboratively we can move ahead. If we cannot do that, it's a challenge. Sometimes it's impossible, but still we are moving. Maybe we are not moving like as required, but we are moving to a direction where we actually trying to integrate a lot of communities, a lot of countries where we should do that. But we have long way to go for this kind of developing. And I think still this is a kind of a cliche kind of a framework, and we should move ahead and talk together, not like developing, but something overarching, integrating system which can actually include everyone into the system. Thank you.
So, I mean, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in the climate agreements aim to address this equity issue and the burden of responsibility. And I definitely sympathized with that. And we have done a bad, I mean, the clean development mechanisms and a lot of the aid that goes to developing countries probably isn't very effective, and we need to rethink how that happens. I should mention I'm originally from a developing country, and I grew up at a time of the Kyoto Protocol, and like I'm originally from Colombia. No one in Colombia cared about climate when I was during this time when I was growing up, let's say. And I get it, right? When you're as an individual, when you're struggling to feed your family, what's going to happen in 20 years, 30 years is not a priority. But the governments have different roles, right? The governments have to look longer term. And the reality is that, I mean, we definitely need to think about who carries the burden, how developed countries pay, but the countries in the developing world do have to start thinking about these issues and taking seriously. Because it isn't just, first of all, it isn't just a hypothetical in the future. Poor air quality kills 700,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa every year. This is a true cost, right? That lack of energy access. And so saying that it isn't, that we have not been responsible for climate as a government, that we haven't been responsible for climate, and so we can't do anything about it. It is also ignoring that there are burdens on your communities that are already happening that need critical attention. And if we just keep going around in the discussion of who pays, nothing gets done. And similarly, I understand like the deforestation in the Amazon, which includes Colombia, where I'm from, is just depressing, right? And I understand that we think, well, communities live from, like, this is what's creating jobs, like all of these grazing, deforestation for grazing. But longer term, these countries are going to be massively affected by this deforestation, right? When the forest is gone, they're the ones that are going to, I mean, we're all going to suffer, but directly. So I do think that we need just a more nuanced discussion of this shared responsibility. I think we definitely need better information. So every country every region in the developing world, for example, is very different. In Africa, we're talking about building infrastructure basically from scratch. Rwanda is a country of 12 million people with an installed power system capacity of 500 megawatts. That's a small power plant in the United States, right? They have to build a lot of infrastructure, and that's going to be expensive. And so is the cost of building that infrastructure as a low carbon infrastructure really that much more? And I don't think we have an answer to that. There's just these assumptions. So I think the discussion has to be more nuanced, and definitely there's a role for developed countries, but it can't just be who's to blame and who's to pay for it.
Thanks, Paulina. And we're at time now, so maybe Frank, if you want to wrap up.
Yeah, we actually have one final question focusing on next steps. And as Keely mentioned, it'd be great if you could just take 30 seconds each to respond. But just what is one key suggestion you have for people in the audience today to continue learning about environmental justice or to begin integrating environmental justice perspectives into their research? So maybe start with Josh.
There's a car that parks across the street from my house in Berkeley. This is a very Berkeley thing. It still has bumper stickers. One of them says, "Don't believe everything you think." And so I would encourage anybody who wants to work on EJ issues to constantly question their own judgment about how they think about things, because I've learned how wrong I am over and over again. And I think that that's helped me become a more mature thinker in this space. And so be humble.
Great, thanks. Christian?
I think for technical folks that do modeling, the low-hanging fruit often is just to look at the distribution of different outcomes or different burdens across demographics. It's just that little extra step you can take with your research. Where is there flooding? Who lives in those places where there's flooding? Where is there extreme heat? Who lives in those places? So I think that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. Just extend your research to consider demographic, recognizing there may be uncertainty, but you can frame your research around scenarios if you can't explicitly account for the uncertainty in where people live.
Thank you. Pradip?
Most of our action is based on rationality. So we commit all the rational action, cost benefit analysis. But I think this EJ and the climate justice issues need a kind of a sacrifice. So if some social psychologists and people, they also study how much a person or community, for example, is altruistic. So otherwise, if we are not altruistic in nature, we cannot sacrifice anything from our own pocket, own lifestyle or anything. So students can study this kind of altruistic attitude of the people along with be sensitive with them. Then I think they can understand how a community or a country is from very individual, like that showed, like from individual level to the global level, who is how much altruistic in nature and who is ready to sacrifice what. So that can actually help us to understand this better rather than blaming and all these things.
Great.
Thank you.
And finally, Paulina?
So following on maybe a little bit related to Josh, I think you need to expand your horizon. we like to live in bubbles. Some of us have lived in very privileged bubbles, and we need to learn more from the people that are not as privileged and really suffer the burden of environmental injustice and climate injustice. And reconsider, I guess, to Josh's point, reconsider where our perspectives come from, and are they really valid, and are we living up to those principles, or are we just talking the talk?
Great, thank you. So that concludes our group session. I just wanted to thank all of the speakers for a really fascinating discussion. Next, we will be splitting up into individual breakout sessions for targeted discussions on energy systems, air pollution, coastal resilience, or climate governance, depending on the group we pick. In each group, we have some sample research projects that audience members were kind enough to volunteer to share, and that'll be just used to kind of kick off the discussion of how we can introduce EJ concerns into that research. And one nice thing about this is the participants are coming from a wide range of universities. So we have people from Princeton, Rutgers, IIT Kanpur, and the University of Pennsylvania. And just a final logistic note, you can find the Zoom link for these breakout sessions in the chat bar. I believe Nick posted it there. And so if you click that link, it'll take you to a new Zoom session, and we'll just divide up into the groups and cover some ground rules for the discussions. So just thank you everybody for joining today, and thank you to all the panelists.
Ugh.